The morning of March 17, 1945, over the Oder River bridgehead east of Berlin, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann advanced the throttle of his Focke-Wulf 190 D-9 and began his climbing turn toward what he assumed was another American-built fighter being flown by a Soviet pilot. The aircraft ahead caught the weak spring sunlight against its dark camouflage, its profile suggesting the familiar lines of an Airacobra, the Bell P-39, that Soviet pilots had been flying in substantial numbers since 1942. Hoffman had engaged Airacobras before. He understood their limitations intimately. The centerline 37mm cannon made them dangerous in head-on passes, but their performance fell away noticeably above 15,000 feet, where the single-stage Allison engine gasped for air in the thin atmosphere. This encounter would unfold differently than Hoffman anticipated. The Soviet pilot in the aircraft ahead was flying a Bell P-63 Kingcobra, an aircraft that shared the Airacobra's distinctive mid-mounted engine and tricycle landing gear, but possessed fundamentally different performance characteristics that would force Hoffman to reassess his tactical assumptions within the next 3 minutes of combat maneuvering. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Kingcobra accelerated away from Hoffman's Focke-Wulf with surprising authority, climbing steadily toward 20,000 feet while maintaining speed that seemed impossible for what Hoffman believed was simply an improved Airacobra. German intelligence reports had mentioned a new Bell fighter reaching Soviet units through the Lend-Lease supply routes that terminated at Murmansk and the Persian Corridor. But frontline pilots received limited, detailed information about American aircraft types that never appeared in Western, European skies. The assumption among Luftwaffe pilots fighting on the Eastern Front held that Soviet Lend-Lease fighters represented American second-line equipment of adequate machines that freed Soviet factories to concentrate on producing ground attack aircraft and bombers, rather than representing the best American engineering could achieve. Hoffman pushed his D-9 harder, the Junkers Jumo 213 engine delivering its full emergency power of 2,100 horsepower as he attempted to close the distance. The Focke-Wulf D-9 represented Germany's answer to high-altitude American escorts, featuring an inline engine installation that delivered superior performance above 20,000 feet compared to the radial-engined Focke-Wulf 190 Anton variants. German pilots considered the D-9 competitive with American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts in most performance categories, particularly in climb rate and acceleration. Yet the Soviet-flown Kingcobra ahead refused to behave like the underpowered, altitude-limited Airacobra that German tactical doctrine had prepared Hoffman to fight. The central question that would occupy German test pilots, intelligence officers, and frontline commanders over the following months emerged from encounters like Hoffman's experience that March morning. How had American designers transformed the fundamentally mediocre Airacobra into an aircraft that performed competitively at altitudes where the original design became nearly helpless? The answer would challenge German assumptions about American engineering philosophy and reveal sophisticated design work that contradicted the comfortable narrative about American reliance on quantity over quality. Part 2. Building the World. The Eastern Front Context. The air war over the Eastern Front during 1945 bore little resemblance to the increasingly one-sided struggle over Western Europe, where American and British fighters dominated German airspace with overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Soviet air tactics emphasized ground support operations rather than strategic bombing campaigns, creating different tactical requirements that shaped both Soviet aircraft design priorities and the types of Lend-Lease aircraft the Soviet Union requested from American production. By early 1945, the Soviet Air Force operated as a massive, brutally effective organization that had evolved dramatically from the force nearly destroyed during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Soviet factories produced enormous quantities of specialized aircraft, optimized for specific roles: Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix for ground attack, Yakovlev fighters for low and medium altitude air superiority, Petlyakov P-2 bombers for tactical strikes. American Lend-Lease fighters supplemented Soviet production, filling gaps in capability and allowing Soviet factories to concentrate resources on aircraft types where Soviet designs excelled. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had arrived in Soviet service beginning in 1942, becoming one of the most numerous American aircraft types supplied through Lend-Lease, with approximately 4,700 delivered by war's end. Soviet pilots initially approached the Airacobra with skepticism, viewing its unusual configuration with the engine mounted behind the pilot and its tricycle landing gear as strange American eccentricity. However, Soviet tactical employment discovered the Airacobra's genuine strengths when used appropriately within its performance envelope. At low and medium altitudes where most Eastern Front air combat occurred, the Airacobra's 37mm cannon and concentrated nose-mounted armament proved devastatingly effective against German fighters and ground targets. Soviet pilots learned to exploit the aircraft's excellent low altitude, the performance, good roll rate, and punishing firepower while avoiding high-altitude combat, where the single-stage supercharged Allison 5-1710 engine lost power rapidly above 12,000 feet. Several top-scoring Soviet RCs flew Airacobras throughout much of the war, including Alexander Pokrishkin, who achieved 59 confirmed victories and became one of only 3 Soviet pilots to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union award 3 times. German pilots fighting on the Eastern Front developed clear tactical understanding of the Airacobra's characteristics through repeated combat encounters. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine emphasized forcing Airacobras into high-altitude combat, where German fighters retained decisive performance advantages. Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustavs and Focke-Wulf 190 Antons could climb above 15,000 feet and attack diving through Airacobra formations that struggled to follow or respond effectively at altitudes. This tactical approach worked consistently enough that German pilots considered the Airacobra a manageable threat when engaged properly. Dangerous primarily when German aircraft were caught at disadvantageous low altitudes, where the Bell fighter excelled. This tactical framework, understanding enemy aircraft limitations and exploiting them systematically, had served the Luftwaffe effectively throughout the war. German intelligence services maintained detailed files on Allied aircraft types, gathering information from combat reports, interrogations of captured pilots, examination of wrecked aircraft, and systematic testing of captured examples at facilities like Rechlin. The intelligence picture of the Airacobra was comprehensive and accurate. German pilots knew what to expect when engaging the type and possessed proven tactical counters. Part Tra, the prevailing assumptions. The appearance of the P-63 Kingcobra in Soviet service during late 1944 and early 1945 initially generated minimal concern among German intelligence analysts and frontline pilots, who assumed the new aircraft represented merely an incremental improvement over the familiar Airacobra. The visual similarity between the two aircraft reinforced this assumption. Both featured the distinctive mid-fuselage engine installation, tricycle landing gear, and car door-style entry that characterized Bell Aircraft Corporation's unconventional design philosophy. German recognition training materials and intelligence briefings described the Kingcobra as an improved Airacobra, without emphasizing the fundamental performance differences that actually separated the two designs. This casual dismissal reflected broader German assumptions about American aircraft development that had calcified into comfortable doctrine by the war's final year. German intelligence assessments acknowledged American excellence in strategic bombing aircraft design and recognized the P-51 Mustang's exceptional capabilities as a long-range escort fighter. However, the prevailing view held that American fighters generally emphasized ruggedness, firepower, and ease of production over sophisticated aerodynamic refinement and maximum performance. The narrative portrayed American aviation engineering as competent but unimaginative, producing solid workmanlike designs that achieved their objectives through brute force and overwhelming numbers, rather than technical elegance. The Airacobra fit this narrative perfectly. The aircraft worked adequately within its limited performance envelope, featured unusual but fundamentally simple design choices, and achieved combat effectiveness through its powerful cannon armament, rather than superior flight performance. German analysts viewed the Airacobra as confirmation that American designers prioritized unconventional solutions and heavy firepower over optimized aerodynamic performance and high-altitude capability. The assumption that the Kingcobra represented simply more of the same seemed entirely reasonable given this analytical framework. German pilots on the Eastern Front during early 1945 faced increasingly desperate tactical circumstances that left little attention available for careful analysis of new enemy aircraft variants. The Soviet offensive that began in January 1945 had shattered German defensive lines along the Vistula River and advanced hundreds of kilometers westward in weeks, reaching the Oder River by early February, and establishing bridgeheads within artillery range of Berlin itself. Luftwaffe units supporting the collapsing Eastern Front operated under impossible conditions. Chronic fuel shortages, limited training and operational sorties, spare parts scarcity reduced aircraft availability, experienced pilots were increasingly scarce after years of brutal attrition, and Soviet numerical superiority had grown overwhelming. Under these circumstances, German pilots focused on immediate survival and mission completion, rather than detailed enemy aircraft identification. Whether the Soviet fighter attacking from above was an Airacobra, Kingcobra, Yak-3 or La-7, mattered less than executing proper defensive maneuvers and attempting to disengage successfully. The Luftwaffe's systematic approach to intelligence gathering and tactical analysis, which had functioned effectively earlier in the war, had degraded severely by 1945. As the organizational infrastructure supporting it collapsed under the weight of Germany's comprehensive military defeat. Yet certain encounters forced attention even amid chaos. When experienced German pilots with hundreds of combat hours repeatedly found themselves unable to shake or outrun aircraft they expected to handle easily based on previous experience with similar types, questions emerged that demanded answers. Werner Hoffmann's experience over the Oder bridgehead that March morning represented one such encounter that could not be easily dismissed or explained through normal combat variables, like pilot skill, disparity, or tactical positioning advantages. The Bell P-63 Kingcobra emerged from a specification that bore little resemblance to the aircraft that would eventually reach Soviet squadrons. Bell Aircraft Corporation began design work in 1942 on what the company initially designated as the Model 33. Envisioned as a direct evolution of the P-39 Airacobra, addressing that aircraft's most significant deficiency, inadequate high-altitude performance caused by the single-stage Allison engine installation. The Army Air Forces issued a contract for the first prototype on June 27, 1942, designating it XP-63. Bell's engineering team, led by Chief Designer Robert Woods and Project Engineer Harland Poirier, understood that simply installing a more powerful engine in the existing Airacobra airframe would produce an aircraft suffering from the same fundamental limitation: the Allison 5-1710 engine, regardless of modifications, could not deliver competitive high-altitude performance without a sophisticated two-stage supercharger system that would substantially increase engine weight, complexity, and frontal area. Bell's solution involved a comprehensive redesign that retained the Airacobra's unconventional layout, mid-mounted engine, tricycle landing gear, car door entry, while creating what was essentially an entirely new aircraft optimized around a substantially more powerful engine. The Kingcobra would use the Allison 5-17-10-93 engine, producing 1,800 horsepower for takeoff and 1,500 horsepower at 21,000 feet through its two-stage mechanical supercharger with aftercooler. This represented a 40% increase in power over the standard Airacobra's engine rating. However, installing this more powerful engine required addressing cascading design implications throughout the airframe. The fuselage lengthened by nearly 21 inches to accommodate the larger engine installation and maintain proper center of gravity. The wing area increased from 213 square feet on the P-39 to 248 square feet on the P-63. featuring a laminar flow airfoil section similar to that used on the P-51 Mustang to reduce drag at higher speeds. The larger wingspan increased from 34 feet to 38 feet 4 inches, improving lift generation and high-altitude performance, while slightly reducing roll rate compared to the lighter Airacobra. The vertical tail area increased substantially to maintain directional stability, with the more powerful engine installation. The four-blade Aero products properly measured 12 feet 2 inches in diameter, nearly 6 inches larger than the Airacobra's propeller, to absorb the additional engine power effectively. Empty weight increased from 5,600 pounds for a typical P-39 to approximately 6,800 pounds for the P-63, reflecting the heavier engine, larger airframe structure, and additional equipment. Armament configuration underwent significant revision from early production standards. Initial P-63 models retained the 37mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub, with 200 rounds of ammunition, supplemented by two 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, with 250 rounds per gun. Later production variants deleted the fuselage-mounted 50-caliber guns, relying entirely on wing-mounted armament. A4 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted two per wing panel with 250 rounds per gun, while retaining the centerline 37mm cannon. Maximum speed specifications for the production P-63 are reached 410 miles per hour at 24,500 feet under military power settings, representing a 50-mile-per-hour improvement over the Airacobra's maximum speed and occurring at substantially higher altitude, where the two-stage supercharger delivered its performance advantage. Rate of climb reached 2,500 feet per minute at sea level, it decreasing gradually with altitude, but remaining effective well above 20,000 feet, where the Airacobra's climb performance deteriorated rapidly. Service ceiling reached 43,000 feet, though practical combat operations rarely exceeded 35,000 feet, where oxygen system limitations and extreme cold affected pilot performance. Range with internal fuel reached 450 miles, extending to over 2,000 miles with external drop tanks installed under the wings. These performance figures positioned the Kingcobra competitively with contemporary American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang in several categories, though it remained inferior to those specialized designs in their optimized roles. The Army Air Forces evaluated the Kingcobra throughout 1943 and into 1944, conducting systematic performance testing at Wright Field and tactical evaluations with operational units. Test pilots reported generally favorable handling characteristics, good stability, and powerful armament effectiveness. However, the strategic situation had evolved substantially since the Kingcobra's initial conception. By 1944, the P-51 Mustang had proven itself decisively as the optimal long-range escort fighter, while the P-47 Thunderbolt dominated fighter-bomber roles. The Kingcobra offered no significant advantage over these established types that would justify disrupting production lines and pilot training programs. The Army Air Force's lack of operational requirement for the Kingcobra coincided perfectly with Soviet requests for additional high-performance fighters to supplement their own production. Soviet military representatives, evaluating American aircraft types under Lend-Lease provisions, expressed strong interest in the Kingcobra during 1944, recognizing that its performance characteristics suited Soviet tactical requirements on the Eastern Front more effectively than they matched American strategic needs in Western Europe and the Pacific. Soviet interest reflected practical operational considerations, rather than desperate acceptance of second-line American equipment. Soviet aviation industry produced excellent fighters optimized for low and medium-altitude combat, where most Eastern Front engagements occurred. The Yakovlev Yak-3 and Yak-9 variants offered outstanding performance below 15,000 feet, with exceptional agility and good speed. The Lavochkin La-5 and La-7 featured powerful radial engines delivering excellent performance throughout their operational envelope. These Soviet designs matched or exceeded German fighters in their optimized altitude ranges. However, Soviet fighters generally suffered from limited range compared to American types, reflecting different tactical requirements. Soviet operations emphasized supporting ground forces through close air support and battlefield air superiority, rather than conducting deep strategic bombing campaigns, requiring long-range escorts. Additionally, Soviet aircraft production prioritized simplicity and ease of manufacture, sometimes accepting reduced equipment sophistication to maximize production numbers from factories operating under difficult wartime conditions. The Kingcobra offered Soviet squadron-specific capabilities that complemented existing Soviet aircraft inventory. Its range exceeded Soviet fighter types substantially, enabling escort missions supporting P-2 medium bombers, striking deeper German rear areas. The two-stage supercharged engine maintained strong performance at altitudes where Soviet fighters began losing effectiveness, providing options when German aircraft attempted to exploit altitude advantages. The concentrated nose armament, particularly the devastating 37mm cannon, delivered firepower that Soviet pilots valued highly based on their positive experience with the Airacobra's similar armament. Between October 1944 and May 1945, the United States delivered approximately 2,400 P-63 Kingcobras to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease supply routes. The primary delivery route ran through Alaska to Siberia, where American pilots ferried aircraft to Fairbanks and Soviet pilots collected them for the flight across Siberia to European Russia. This northern route remained operational throughout the year despite extreme weather, though winter conditions made ferry flights particularly hazardous. Secondary routes through Iran delivered some aircraft, though the Alaska-Siberia route handled the majority of fighter deliveries. Soviet maintenance crews and pilots received training on the Kingcobra through a combination of technical manuals translated into Russian, instruction from American technical representatives stationed at receiving locations, and practical experience gained from the similar Airacobra already operated extensively in Soviet service. The aircraft entered service with Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment's elite units that received priority equipment allocation and featured the most experienced pilots available. Typical Soviet employment of Kingcobras during early 1945 focused on several specific mission profiles that exploited the aircraft's strengths. High-altitude bomber escort missions protecting P-2 formations, striking German logistics networks and command facilities behind the front lines, utilized the Kingcobra's superior high-altitude performance and extended range. Fighter sweeps ahead of Soviet ground offensives sought to establish temporary air superiority over critical sectors, with Kingcobras engaging German fighters, attempting to interfere with Sturmoviks attacking German defensive positions. Armed reconnaissance missions, deep into German rear areas, identified targets for subsequent strikes, while engaging opportunity targets with the aircraft's heavy armament. Soviet pilots appreciated the Kingcobra's robust construction and ability to sustain battle damage while remaining controllable. The mid-mounted engine installation, while unconventional, provided some protection from ground fire during low-altitude operations, since the engine mass sat behind the pilot rather than directly in front where it would be exposed to fire from ahead. The tricycle landing gear simplified operations from rough forward airfields where Soviet forces often operated, reducing ground loop accidents that plagued tailwheel fighters when operated by less experienced pilots on marginal surfaces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Werner Hoffmann's encounter over the Oder bridgehead that March morning forced immediate tactical reassessment when his Focke-Wulf D-9 failed to close on the Soviet-flown Kingcobra despite using full emergency power. Hoffman possessed sufficient experience to recognize that something fundamental differed between this aircraft and the Airacobras he had engaged previously. The climb rate, sustained speed at altitude, and acceleration characteristics all exceeded what he expected based on tactical doctrine developed from extensive Airacobra combat. Hoffman attempted a diving attack, using his Focke-Wulf's excellent dive performance to build closing speed. The Kingcobra pilot recognized the threat and dove as well, maintaining separation while descending toward lower altitude, where Soviet pilot typically preferred fighting. Hoffman followed through the dive, his airspeed building rapidly past 450 miles per hour. The Kingcobra remained ahead, its dive performance matching the WWII's capability, without displaying the control stiffening or stability problems that affected many fighters at high speeds. At 8,000 feet, the Soviet pilot pulled out of the dive smoothly and immediately reversed toward Hoffman's Focke-Wulf. The 37mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, concentrated in the Kingcobra's nose, represented devastating firepower in a head-on pass. Hoffman broke hard right, using his fighter's excellent roll rate to avoid the attack geometry. The Kingcobra flashed past, the Soviet pilot declining to follow into a turning fight, where the heavier American aircraft would be disadvantaged. Instead, the Soviet pilot extended away using superior speed, then climbed back to altitude, where the engagement began. Hoffman attempted pursuit, but found himself unable to close the distance. The Kingcobra maintained its energy state throughout the maneuvering, neither bleeding speed excessively during turns, nor requiring extended time to rebuild lost energy. This energy management capability indicated sophisticated pilot technique, combined with aircraft performance that provided options throughout the engagement. After several additional inconclusive passes, Hoffman disengaged and returned to his airfield with fuel running low. His combat report noted the engagement with what he tentatively identified as an improved Airacobra that demonstrated substantially better high-altitude performance than expected. This report joined others from pilots across various Eastern Front sectors who described similar encounters with Bell fighters that refused to behave according to established tactical expectations. Luftwaffe intelligence sections began receiving these reports with increasing frequency during late winter and early spring of 1945. Individual reports might be dismissed as combat confusion or pilot error, but the pattern across multiple independent encounters from different units suggested something requiring systematic investigation. Intelligence officers requested that any forced down or captured examples of the new Bell variant be secured for technical evaluation. In April 1945, German recovery teams reached a damaged Kingcobra that had made a forced landing in territory still under German control following mechanical failure. The pilot had escaped, but the aircraft remained largely intact despite damage from the emergency landing. Recovery personnel transported the wreckage to the nearest Luftwaffe technical facility, still operational in the collapsing German defensive perimeter. German engineers and intelligence specialists examined the aircraft systematically, despite the deteriorating military situation and increasingly chaotic conditions. They measured the larger wing area, noted the different engine installation with two-stage supercharger, documented the modified armament configuration, and inspected structural details that revealed this represented far more than a simple Airacobra variant. The technical evaluation confirmed what combat pilots had reported. The Kingcobra possessed fundamentally different performance characteristics that made it substantially more capable at medium and high altitudes. The examination revealed sophisticated engineering work throughout the aircraft. The laminar flow wing design demonstrated American mastery of advanced aerodynamic principles. The two-stage supercharger installation showed careful attention to cooling and integration challenges. The robust structural design provided safety margins that German aircraft increasingly lacked as material shortages forced acceptance of reduced structural factors. German engineers recognized professional competence in the design, a work that contradicted comfortable assumptions about American engineering priorities. However, this technical intelligence arrived too late to influence tactical doctrine or operational planning meaningfully. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front had effectively ceased functioning as a coherent fighting force. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining aircraft. Operational airfields fell to advancing Soviet forces almost daily. Experienced pilots were dead, captured, or withdrawn westward. The systematic intelligence gathering and tactical adaptation that had characterized German military effectiveness earlier in the war had collapsed entirely under the weight of comprehensive strategic defeat. The technical intelligence gathered from examining the captured Kingcobra circulated through remaining Luftwaffe intelligence channels during the final weeks of the war in Europe. Detailed reports reached fighter command headquarters, technical evaluation centers, and operational units, still capable of receiving and processing such information. The documentation confirmed that American designers had created an aircraft substantially more capable than the Airacobra, in precisely the areas where the original design had proven deficient. High-altitude performance, speed, and sustained climb rate. For German pilots still flying combat missions during April and early May of 1945, this intelligence offered limited practical value. Understanding that the Kingcobra could reach 410 miles per hour at altitude and maintain effective performance above 20,000 feet provided no tactical advantage when German fighters lacked fuel to intercept at those altitudes, when pilot training had deteriorated to the point where new pilots could barely fly their aircraft competently, and when the entire defensive infrastructure supporting fighter operations had collapsed under relentless Soviet offensive pressure. Werner Hoffmann survived the war, surrendering to American forces in early May 1945, rather than face Soviet captivity. Post-war interviews conducted during the 1960s found him reluctant to discuss his final months of combat operations on the Eastern Front, though he acknowledged that Soviet-flown American fighters had proven far more capable than German intelligence assessments initially suggested. His encounter with the Kingcobra over the Oder bridgehead represented one engagement among hundreds he flew during his combat career, notable primarily for forcing recognition that American aircraft development had produced sophisticated designs that contradicted German propaganda narratives. The Wandersitticus Rosarius program, which had systematically tested captured Allied aircraft and conducted demonstrations at operational Luftwaffe bases earlier in the war, had ceased functioning by the time Kingcobras appeared in significant numbers on the Eastern Front. The organizational infrastructure supporting captured aircraft testing, the specialized recovery teams, the technical facilities with skilled personnel, the fuel allocations for demonstration flights, the operational bases with time available for training sessions, had disintegrated as Germany's military collapse accelerated during 1945's opening months. Some Luftwaffe technical personnel proposed conducting detailed performance testing of the captured Kingcobra to gather comprehensive intelligence on its capabilities and develop tactical recommendations for engaging the type effectively. These proposals went nowhere. The testing facilities at Rechlin had been evacuated or overrun. Skilled test pilots were unavailable or assigned to combat duties. Aviation fuel existed in quantities sufficient only for minimal defensive operations. Certainly not for systematic testing programs. The war would end before any comprehensive German evaluation of Kingcobra performance could occur. Soviet forces continued flying Kingcobras throughout the final offensive operations that carried the Red Army into Berlin and across Germany to the Elbe River, where Soviet and American forces met in late April. Soviet Pilot achieved combat success with the type, though detailed records of specific engagements remain limited and often unreliable due to the chaotic final weeks of the European War and subsequent Soviet record-keeping practices during the immediate post-war period. The psychological impact on German pilots who encountered Kingcobras and recognized their superior performance added another increment to the crushing weight of evidence, demonstrating that Germany had lost the technological and industrial competition that underpinned modern warfare. German propaganda had consistently portrayed American engineering as inferior to German technical sophistication, emphasizing quantity over quality and crude simplicity over refined performance. Direct combat experience with aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and now the P-63 Kingcobra systematically demolished these comfortable narratives. German pilots confronted the reality that American designers created sophisticated, high-performance aircraft, incorporating advanced aerodynamic research, powerful and reliable engines, and thoughtful systems integration that matched or exceeded German achievements. American industry produced these advanced designs in overwhelming quantities, while maintaining consistent quality standards that German dispersed production could no longer achieve. American training programs prepared pilots thoroughly with hundreds of flight hours before combat assignment, while German pilot training had collapsed to dangerously inadequate levels due to fuel shortages. The Kingcobra represented one more piece of evidence in an overwhelming case that German pilots could no longer deny or rationalize away. They fought enemies with superior equipment, better training, vastly greater numbers, and industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. Individual courage, tactical skill, and professional competence could not overcome these fundamental disadvantages. The war was lost, comprehensively and irreversibly. The P-63 Kingcobra's combat career effectively ended with Germany's surrender in May 1945. Soviet forces retained the aircraft in service for several years following the war, though the type saw declining use as Soviet aviation industry focused on developing indigenous jet fighters that rendered piston engine designs obsolete for frontline air defense and air superiority roles. Some Kingcobras remained in Soviet inventory through the late 1940s, serving primarily in training roles and with second-line units before final retirement. The United States Army Air Forces never employed Kingcobras in frontline combat roles, having determined during the aircraft's development that it offered no significant advantages over the P-51 Mustang for escort missions, or the P-47 Thunderbolt for fighter bomber operations. American Kingcobras served almost exclusively in specialized training roles, most famously as pinball aircraft for aerial gunnery training, where the aircraft's robust construction allowed it to absorb hits from frangible training ammunition that shattered on impact rather than penetrating the bar aircraft structure. Historical assessment of the Kingcobra's effectiveness faces challenges due to limited documentation of Soviet combat employment and the absence of American operational use against Axis forces. The aircraft clearly possessed superior performance compared to the Airacobra, particularly at medium and high altitudes, where the two-stage supercharged engine delivered substantial power advantages. Soviet pilots who flew the type in combat generally reported favorably on its capabilities, appreciating the familiar handling characteristics inherited from the Airacobra, combined with improved performance throughout the altitude range. However, the Kingcobra arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to influence the Eastern Front's strategic outcomes significantly. By late 1944, when deliveries began reaching Soviet units in substantial quantities, the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front had already been reduced to shadow strength through relentless attrition. Soviet air superiority was well established and maintained primarily through overwhelming numerical advantage, and the effectiveness of Soviet-designed fighters like the Yak-3 and La-7 operating in their optimal altitude range. The Kingcobra's true significance lies not in decisive combat impact, but in what the aircraft reveals about American aviation development during World War II and the sophistication of American engineering, approaches that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Bell Aircraft Corporation transformed a fundamentally mediocre design, the P-39 Airacobra, with its poor high-altitude performance into a competitive fighter through comprehensive redesign that addressed original's limitations systematically. This transformation required sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics, propulsion systems integration, and structural engineering. The laminar flow wing design incorporated advanced research into boundary layer control and drag reduction. The two-stage supercharger installation demanded careful attention to cooling requirements, intake design, and power plant integration challenges. The enlarged airframe needed proper structural analysis to ensure adequate strength without excessive weight penalties. American engineers executed this complex redesign successfully while maintaining the unconventional mid-engine layout that characterized Bell's design philosophy. German engineers examining the captured Kingcobra recognized professional competence throughout the aircraft's design and construction. The quality of materials, precision of manufacturing, and sophistication of systems integration all demonstrated that American aviation industry had mastered the technical challenges of modern fighter design as thoroughly as German industry. This recognition arrived too late to influence German aircraft development or tactical doctrine, but it forced acknowledgement that American technical capabilities exceeded the dismissive assessments that German propaganda had promoted throughout the war. The broader lesson extends beyond specific aircraft performance comparisons to fundamental questions about how military organizations assess enemy capabilities and adapt to evolving technological realities. German intelligence during World War II oscillated between accurate technical assessment and ideologically driven dismissal of enemy achievements, particularly regarding American and Soviet capabilities, when assessment accuracy mattered most during the critical period, when Germany might have adjusted strategy to account for growing Allied advantages. Ideological assumptions often overrode objective analysis. Werner Hoffmann's experience over the Oder bridgehead that March morning in 1945 encapsulates the psychological journey that thousands of German pilots experienced during the war's final year. The comfortable certainties about German technical superiority, the effectiveness of German training and tactics, and the supposed inferiority of Allied equipment dissolved under the weight of direct combat experience that could not be rationalized away or dismissed through ideological commitment. Hoffman had entered the war confident in German aviation superiority, supported by early victories that seemed to confirm that confidence. His training emphasized German technical excellence and tactical sophistication that would ensure victory over numerically superior, but qualitatively inferior opponents. The Luftwaffe's performance during the war's opening campaigns appeared to validate these assumptions completely. German fighters dominated Polish, French, and initially Soviet opposition through combination of superior aircraft, better trained pilots, and more effective tactical doctrine. The gradual erosion of these certainties occurred through accumulating evidence that eventually became impossible to deny. American fighters appeared over Europe with performance that matched or exceeded German types. Allied production increased to levels that seemed almost incomprehensible to German pilots accustomed to chronic equipment shortages. Allied pilot quality improved steadily as American and British training programs produced well-prepared aviators, while German training deteriorated under fuel shortages and instructor loss. Each encounter with aircraft like the Kingcobra added incremental evidence to an overwhelming case. The aircraft that Hoffman expected to handle easily based on his experience with Airacobras instead demonstrated performance that forced him to fight defensively, unable to impose his tactical preference on an opponent with superior speed and climb capability. This single engagement mattered little in strategic terms. The war's outcome would have been identical had the encounter never occurred, but psychologically, such experiences accumulated into crushing recognition of comprehensive defeat. The story of German pilots encountering the Kingcobra and recognizing its unexpected capabilities illustrates how direct material evidence eventually overcomes even deeply held ideological beliefs. German propaganda had invested enormous effort in portraying American engineering as crude and unsophisticated, emphasizing that American industrial strength produced adequate quantities of mediocre equipment rather than technically excellent designs. This narrative served important psychological functions, maintaining German morale and fighting spirit, by suggesting that German technical superiority would eventually overcome Allied numerical advantages. Combat experience systematically demolished this comforting narrative. German pilots flew against American fighters and discovered sophisticated designs that incorporated advanced aerodynamic research, powerful reliable engines, thoughtful ergonomics, and robust construction. They examined captured American aircraft and found high-quality materials, precise manufacturing, and engineering solutions that demonstrated technical competence equal to German achievements. They recognized that American pilots arrived at combat units with thorough training that often exceeded what German pilots received in the war's later stages. The Kingcobra represented one specific example within this broader pattern of forced recognition. The aircraft's performance characteristics: 410 miles per hour at altitude, effective operation above 20,000 feet, good handling throughout its envelope, contradicted the assumption that Bell fighters were limited to low-altitude operations, where unsophisticated single-stage engines remained adequate. German pilots who encountered the type and survived to report their experiences added their testimony to the accumulating evidence that American aviation had achieved technical sophistication that German intelligence assessments had consistently underestimated. This recognition arrived far too late to influence outcomes. By the time Kingcobras appeared on the Eastern Front in significant numbers, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery through tactical innovation or technical development. The war would end within months regardless of whether German pilots understood Kingcobra capabilities accurately. Yet the psychological impact of this forced recognition mattered to the individuals who experienced it, shattering comfortable assumptions and requiring acceptance of uncomfortable truths about relative capabilities. Werner Hoffmann climbed into his Focke-Wulf D-9 and prepared to engage what he assumed was another manageable Airacobra. He carried expectations shaped by years of training, propaganda, and combat experience. 3 minutes later, after failing to catch an aircraft that refused to behave according to his tactical assumptions, those expectations required revision. The revision came too late to matter strategically, but it arrived with undeniable force nonetheless. One more German pilot, forced to recognize that the enemy he faced possessed capabilities that exceeded comfortable assumptions about American engineering limitations. The Kingcobra never achieved fame comparable to the Mustang or Thunderbolt. It served primarily with Soviet forces rather than American units, limiting its visibility in Western historical accounts. Its combat career lasted only months before Germany's surrender ended the European War. Yet the aircraft's story reveals important truths about technological development, intelligence assessment, and the psychological impact of forced recognition when ideological assumptions collide with material reality. Sometimes the most significant lessons emerge not from decisive battles or famous aircraft, but from small encounters that force uncomfortable acknowledgement of truths that propaganda and wishful thinking had obscured. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.